So in the last episode, we successfully made our effect, right?
We're done. Yeah, we're done. That's it.
Okay.
Stop watching.
All right.
Just kidding. Subscribe, please.
Okay. We made an effect, but it's not a great effect, right? We've got some cool sparks, or embers rather, bursting, but that's not really what an explosion is. When we think of an explosion, there's going to be fire and smoke and probably a really hot flash. I definitely want to get to the fire and smoke, but there's a little bit more work we need to do in this particular episode to make us comfortable working in the material editor. So I'm going to use the opportunity to actually focus on the flash element of an explosion. Do you remember last episode how I said that like these particular feedback style effects, they're all about the way it feels and it needs to feel poppy?
Yeah.
One of the key things you can do to make an explosion and an effect feel poppy is put a big flash in the front of it that it lasts 3 to 5 frames. And so that's what we're going to do. However, we don't actually know how to put textures on our particles yet because everything we've been doing so far is just these fuzzy little dots. So that's what we're going to dive into in this particular episode, the material editor.
Sure.
Let's do it. You ready?
Yeah.
Okay. If we look at the materials section up here, which you can find by clicking on Sprite Renderer and going down here, or just clicking up at the top, you can double click and it'll open up this window, and then I can come over here and just double click on the icon and the material editor is going to open. This is, once again, a brand new tool. Julian, I think you've definitely seen a bunch of artists working in this quite a bit. This is actually an area where a lot of us spend most of our time. The simulation itself is quite coarse. We don't have a lot of particles usually to play with in game effects, and so these materials really, really do make a difference in the final look. This particular default one, it's a little bit more complex than I wish it was for the sake of this explanation, because there's a lot of noodles and squiggly lines and stuff, right? So all that I really want you to know for now is that we're using a graph layout that reads from the left to the right, and this right is sort of the plugs where we connect everything that actually renders. And so you can see there's one that says the emissive color. That's going to be the data that flows into that is going to be the actual color that's rendering on our sprite, and then the opacity is going to make it transparent or not transparent. So for example, if I come over here and just disconnect this, and for posterity I'm going to just put in a simple 3 value solid value. We'd used the names float versus vector before, right? So I'm going to make a 3vec attribute, and I did that with shortcuts by pressing the number 3 and then left clicking. You can also make 2 by pressing 2 and 1 by pressing 1. You could come in here and right click and use the context menu to search for it, but it's, there's a lot of stuff in here, and so I use hotkeys when I can. So I just want to plug a solid color white into this and show you what it actually looks like. And so white is a value of 1. And then I want to remove our texture over here as well. And so I'm going to do the same thing for the opacity. The opacity is not RGB. It's just one input. And so I'm going to make a single scalar and plug that in, or float rather, not scalar. And I'm going to set that to 1 as well. A value of 1 means it's fully visible. A value of 0 means it's fully transparent. Now when I come over here and I hit apply or save, apply tends to be just a smidge faster. What we should see out of my effect is squares, right? I've just removed all of the shaping and texture and everything else. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, I guess the one question I'd have is that when we see it in the material editor, we still see it as a circle.
Oh yeah, that's a good call out here. So the reason that we do that is because the preview mesh is a sphere. If I set it to a plane like our particles, then we actually see as it's just solid. This preview, once again, is not, I tend to just avoid the previews, and I try to look at everything in context. So I almost never look at that as well. All the rest of these nodes we can kind of ignore for now, and we'll go into it a little bit later. I don't want to continue mucking with the default, so I'm going to go ahead and just close this, and we're going to make our own material. So I'm going to go back to the content browser, right click, and say material. We tend to use the prefix of just m underscore, and so this one is going to be m underscore flash. When I open this, I now get a completely blank material. And you notice that all of the properties have changed a little bit. That's because this is by default set up assuming that you're trying to make geometry materials, so materials that receive light and work with all the necessary things for your environment, art, etc. For particles, Most of the time when we can, we try to avoid lighting. And so I'm just going to come down here for simplicity. Lighting is such an insanely complex conversation, and it's different with each project. And it's like, that is a huge can of worms. And so for simplicity, we're just going to turn off the lighting. And so I'm going to take the shading model input and say unlit. The moment I do that, you can see that now I've got just emissive color. The other thing is that we want transparency, and that's a really big difference between most of the environment art in a game. It's usually fully opaque, and so the game engine has a whole bunch of optimizations built around the fact that you're never going to see through it. With our particles, that's often not true, and so we want to just make this translucent. Translucent, you can think transparent, same thing, and now when I do that, you can see that now I have an opacity plug. So to get back to where we were, I'm going to type 3 and 1, plug these in. Come back over here. Let's pick a different color, Julian. What do you want it?
Always going to go for hot pink.
All right, always hot pink. I like it. So that is now hot pink. I'm going to hit apply. And now if I go back to my effect, I need to tell this particle system, this sprite renderer, to use this material. The easiest way to do that, if you can see your content browser, I tend to work on 2 monitors, so this is very easy. It's just to drag and drop. I could also have it selected over here and click the little arrow, or once again, I could browse to it, etc. So now that I've done that, when we play our effect, we can see pink squares, right?
Yep, looks great.
Perfect.
It's a bit like confetti.
Yeah. Now, the one thing that isn't happening is, do you remember how our particle system used to color our particles?
Yeah.
I've got this scale color. We're still animating it, but it's just not passing through to the material. The reason for that is quite literal. Right now, the only data being told to draw on that sprite is pink with an opacity of 1. And so what we want to do is give it an input to be able to read that information from the particle system. That is quite conveniently just called the particle color node. And so now if I were to, instead of your pink, plug in, and I should call out these pins, you can see there's a white, red, green, blue, and then grayish pin as an output. This is the red channel, the green channel, the blue channel, and the alpha channel, and then the white one is RGB. So if I just plug this in, then I'm replacing pink. And if I plug this in, then I'm replacing alpha. And now I'm literally just passing the data that we'd set in Niagara into the material, and that's what's going to render. We won't be able to preview it here. But if I come back over here and spawn our effect, we can see that we're getting the right colors. We don't have a texture anymore. We've got rid of the circle still, but our colors and our alpha are now passing through.
So we're back to where we were. The only difference is now we've got this square sort of texture that we've created.
We don't actually have a texture. So
right,
what we're seeing is the entire sprite.
Got it
now. It's just a solid colored sprite.
Got it.
So let's talk about a texture now. So if I go to my desktop, these 3 files are what we're providing for you guys. And in this case, I have this core flash texture. What I've done is just gone into Photoshop and just grabbed one of the nature brushy photos and then stuck it through the liquify tool, smudged around, painted black. It's just an abstract, slightly organic shape. These are really useful, but in this case with a flash, what we want is just like something that feels a little bit natural and not solid colored, but is just big and voluminous, so smudgy.
And for the people that may want to create this rather than downloading this asset from our description in this video, is it important that when they create this that the bounds of this are pure black, like not to have anything that extends and leaks over?
Yes. Okay. That is the only thing that's really important about what we're doing right now.
Okay.
Is just to make sure that the edges of this are all black. Because what I'm going to do is I'm going to plug this into our alpha. I'm going to let our colors still be controlled entirely by the particle simulation, but the alpha is going to be this texture. And so everywhere that's black is transparent. Everywhere that's white is visible.
Makes sense.
So yeah, one of the last things that I'll always do is just like run a black paintbrush along the edges just to make sure I've hit it all.
That we don't get any clipping of the texture. Yeah,
yep.
Makes sense.
So once you have your texture that you want, there's a couple ways that you can import it into the content browser. You could click import over here and browse to it. You can also just drag and drop. And then if there were options, that import dialog would pop up. Because it's just a simple texture, there weren't any options, and so it just dropped it in here. We use the prefix T underscore for our textures. Again, we try to just name things so they can be found quite easily. If I double click this, I get another tool, one that we don't really have to do much in for now, but this is the texture previewer. And so you can see what each individual channel is. So there's no alpha on this texture. Each channel in the texture is the same grayscale image. Any questions here?
No, it makes sense so far.
Cool. Now we get to have some fun. couple ways you could create a texture. You could just drag it in here, and you can see that the material editor has created a texture sample node. I could also press T and left click for texture sample, or of course I could right click and type texture sample and then assign the texture.
And so texture is an element of a material.
Yeah. Yeah, so if you remember back in our very early introduction to Unreal, there's meshes or geometry, which would be the actual, like the physical geometry modeled of this desk. And then the material controls the way the light properties interact with it. And so you can see like we have a little bit of reflection off of our desk. The texture itself is going to be the wood grain of the desk.
Makes sense.
So I suppose in like an infinite fidelity world, we could model the wood grain, but we're probably going to paint it.
Makes sense.
So here we have our texture. And now if I want to plug in our texture instead of the particle color, I would just come over here and grab whichever channel I want to use. This is a grayscale image. I did not bring in a texture that has a separate alpha. Sometimes we do that. For now, this is just a grayscale image. And so I'm just going to grab the red channel and plug that into our opacity. Now the preview updates, and you can see in the, I guess I could make this window bigger. You can see that we've now defined our texture. And if I hit update, go back to Niagara, I'm going to just make this loop so that I don't have to keep pressing space for you. Remind me to turn that off before we go back to play the game again. It's a little bit hard to see on our sparks because they're really skinny, but you might be able to notice that it's not a perfect sphere anymore. To help us with this, what I'm going to do is just make another new emitter for our flash. We can start working on this. So I'm going to start with an empty emitter again. It's a flash, so what I want to do is just burst some particles. I'm going to say 3. And then I want these to be quite large, but live for a very, very short amount of time. So I'm going to do a random, and I'm going to make it lived for 0.0, 0.1, 0.1, and 0.2 seconds. I'm going to go down to the size and make it, let's do a random non-uniform. And I want these to be large. I think, let's do 50 to 150 and maybe 150 to 200, something like that. Okay, so we start to see that we've got something kind of flashing.
Not to interrupt your flow, but I think important as I've learned for us to name our...
I love it. Thank you. You should also remind me to save again.
Yep.
So we'll call this core flash. And I'm going to hit save. Okay. I think just so that we can see what we're working with, I'm going to set the lifespan to be a little bit longer again. So I'll just go back to maybe 1 and 2. And now if I assign the material, so if I go back over here, not the texture, the material, grab the right thing, you can see that let me move this up in the world as well. Those are our sprites, right? We're doing it. Let's go back to the material again. What I've done is I've replaced my ability to control the alpha in the particle system. And so I can't fade this out anymore, which I really want to be able to do. And so here's where we start to treat colors as just pure math. This is where it gets kind of fun. I've been saying all along that a value of 0 is equal to black and a value of 1 is equal to white, right? So we think of the colors in terms of numbers. If I wanted to blend between the texture numbers and the numbers coming out of Niagara, do you have any idea what I should do?
Assuming we should make a curve between the two things?
Mathematically, I don't know why you would actually know this without me having taught you yet. So, but it's a little bit of a mind bend, but I can actually just multiply them.
Oh, I see.
And so I created multiply by pressing M and then left clicking. Again, you can right click and hit multiply. Plug that in. And now what's going to happen is when I put 1 into the alpha in Niagara, it's 1 times whatever my texture value is. And when I put 0 into the alpha in Niagara, it's 0 times whatever my texture value is, which means 0 times 0 is what? 0. And 1 times anything is
The same result.
right. So I've just mathematically given myself controls to blend between the data coming out of Niagara and my texture. If I go back to Niagara now and give myself a scale by color and animate this, so if I just click to add a curve, then we can see them fading out.
Nice.
Right? So we've just given ourselves that control. Okay. Do you have any questions in the material right now?
I think it's making sense so far, yeah.
Okay, let me quiz you a little bit. Now, if we wanted the ability to also custom define in the material our paint color, but we wanted to also keep the particle color, how would we blend them?
Can we use multiply again?
We totally can. We can use add as well. It's just going to be different controls, but multiply is definitely the one that you want. If you're used to working in Photoshop, you can think of the multiply blend layer mode. So I would just do this. And now we have pink flashy sprites that are a little bit hard to see, but I also still have the ability to go back into Niagara and change the color. So if I wanted to challenge your pink and make them bluer, we can do that here too, right? So as we're working in materials, like I said at the beginning of this, we spend a lot of time in our materials as effects artists, and that's because we're constantly having to go back and create more controls, remove controls, change the way things actually work. There's a lot that you can do in materials, really just setting up the most basic, useful particle function here. In this case, I don't want to control the color as pink in the material. I'm just going to leave it at being able to control it in Niagara, and what we have is a perfectly usable particle material, your very first particle material.
We did.
So let's go back and make that flash now. Finish this up. I'm going to set this to white again. And the last thing on the initialized particle is I want for these to be, so I've got random scales, but I also want random rotations because I don't want a pattern to pop up. So I'm going to come down to the rotation, which is right here, sprite rotation method, and I'm just going to set it to random. Great, now I get random rotations. I am also going to set our lifespan back to be really, really short. I think I'd set it to 0.1 and 0.2. Okay, so we have the starts of a little bit of a pop. One of the things that makes things feel really poppy is growth, right? Like what's happening right now is as soon as this particle spawns in, it stays still, and you can kind of see it. It's fading out, and it's kind of giving a little bit of an impression of shrinking, but this is supposed to be explosive and expansive. So we're going to scale the size as well. So if I search for size, sprite scale, or scale sprite size. And now what I want to do is have it, we'll have it start at 0, that's fine. But I'm actually going to grab that quick shortcut and just make it so that it grows quite quickly upwards. And then I'm going to have it get bigger. I don't know. I just deleted the entire module. I meant to just delete this keyframe. But instead I'm going to bring the keyframe down a little. So now we're starting to see that the particle is actually expanding even though it's quick and poppy. So even though it's only on for a few frames, we still wanted to imply the rest of the motion of the rest of the effect. What color should it be? Don't say pink.
My instinct was sort of like a yellow, like a bright yellow. When I think about a flash, like something like between yellow and orange.
All right.
We'll make it going for an authentic explosion.
Yeah, I think
Not my unicorn fairyland.
I think in this case, we don't necessarily need to animate the color. So let's just try setting a really nice, like hot, fiery orange over here with it. Maybe pump it up to 5. It's going to be a little bit tricky to color match with the embers. But also, once we get the smoke in here, this is something else that we would tweak to polish. So I'm going to kind of get this into place. I think maybe 5 is a little bit too big for the... No, let's go higher. Let's make it hotter, just for fun. We'll do 15. And then I want to, I think, bring down the size of it. It feels a little bit...
Yeah, it feels like it's dominating the down a little bit, yeah.
So I have this scaling up to 3. I think I'll do like 1.5. It's also living a little bit too long. It's hard to tell right now, so let's go look at it in context. Remember, if we press play, we can also just see our effect again. Yeah, it's living too long. And maybe once we make it shorter, we could do bigger. I think let's tweak it a little bit. So I'm gonna make it shorter. 0.2 seconds is way too long. If we think about this in terms of frames, how long would you want a flash typically to last?
I think like maybe a frame.
Like 1 to 3 frames,
Yeah,
something like that. Really We're probably playing at 30 frames a second, and so we can come in here and do like 0.05 and 0.08. Get something that's really just there for 1 or 2 frames. Yeah. So let's try that. I'm going to hit save again, and Yeah. So now we get the gesture of that pop, right? But it doesn't live long enough for us to hate the lack of detail in our static texture. So as we continue working on this, I'll want to tweak the size a little bit, and I'll want to work on the colors a little bit more, but I think we need to add more elements. So we'll pause here for this particular episode. What we've done so far is learned about the material graph and learned how to just make a really, really basic particle material that takes the data out of Niagara for your color and opacity and plugs it into your material. And then we use that to just make a very fast flash effect for our explosion. In the next episode, I want to actually really get into the meat and potatoes of a grenade explosion and teach you about putting an image sequence or a movie or what we call a flipbook onto a particle effect to make the fiery core and detailed churning smoke that is actually going to make this start to feel like a really cool.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm excited. And then if you guys are enjoying the content and you're learning something, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on social. All those links are in the description below. And those are also on our website, beyondfx.com. We have short form content, we have some medium form tutorials, and we're constantly adding new educational resources. So definitely stay tuned, and we'll see you guys in the next episode.